Not everyone is quick to call it mysticism. Some say the world is full of coincidences we simply refuse to explain. Others prefer to see signs, even where there are none. This story begins with a warning broadcast, one of those sensational programs that promise real cases of strange and tragic events. Tonight's episode teased unsettling headlines: a night gathering in an abandoned burial ground that ended in disaster, strange ritual objects found among the graves, and a young woman caught between fascination and fear of a subculture she barely understood. Years ago, a university student named Elena Markova, 20, found herself drifting into a group of classmates who called themselves nocturnals. They dressed in black, wore heavy makeup, and were obsessed with aesthetics of decay, poetry about death, and spending nights in unusual places just to feel atmosphere. Elena didn't fully belong there. She preferred quiet evenings and sketching in her notebook. But her friend Maya was deeply attached to one of the boys in the group, Daniel, and so she often dragged Elena along so she wouldn't be alone. Their circle also included Alex, a quiet but influential figure who always suggested the strangest meeting places. One evening, they decided to celebrate Daniel's birthday in a forgotten cemetery on the edge of town, not far from the student dorms. It was supposed to be different, memorable, even beautiful in a dark way. At first, everything looked like any other gathering. A small fire burned between old stone crosses. Someone brought snacks, another a bottle of cheap wine. They laughed, made ironic toasts, and talked about life and death as if they were concepts from a philosophy class rather than real experiences. Elena mostly stayed silent. She watched the flames flicker against the cracked headstones and felt a growing discomfort she couldn't explain. The place didn't feel romantic to her, it felt forgotten. Maya, however, was laughing too loudly, trying to impress Daniel. Alex was telling stories about energy and places where the past never leaves, while the group slowly drifted deeper into a mood that mixed alcohol, imagination, and reckless curiosity. What began as a harmless celebration would later become something none of them could fully agree on in memory. Because that night, something happened that fractured their group forever and left Elena with images she would keep trying to forget for years afterward. And whenever she closed her eyes, she didn't see poetry or mystery. She only saw firelight on stone, and the moment everything stopped feeling like a game, Katerina had been against the idea from the very beginning. She didn't want a fire lit so close to the old bones scattered across the ground. But no one really listened to her. In their minds, it was just part of the atmosphere. And in their world, what was there to fear? To them, disturbing the dead wasn't disrespectful. It was almost symbolic. Roman, on the other hand, saw it as a good omen, something poetic rather than disturbing. Everyone except Katerina seemed excited by the idea. Even the first toast wasn't the usual celebratory one you'd expect. Instead of drinking to the birthday boy, they raised their glasses to death itself, its silence, its mystery, its endless searching. People often misunderstood their subculture. Goths, as they called themselves, weren't just about fashion. To them, it was philosophy, music, emotional expression, sometimes dark, sometimes theatrical, often misunderstood. They listened to complex, melancholic music and dressed in black not necessarily because they worshipped death, but because they were drawn to themes of sadness, introspection, and emotional intensity. Outsiders liked to exaggerate it, turning it into something more extreme than it really was. As one commentator once said, most people, regardless of style or subculture, actually relate to death in a similar way, with fear or uncertainty. Those who claim not to fear it often perform confidence rather than truly feel it. And the Gothic scene, despite its imagery, is usually more about aesthetics and identity than any literal desire for self-destruction. The night went on. At some point, Sergei, already heavily intoxicated, started paying attention to Katerina in a way that made her uncomfortable. She wasn't indifferent to him, but she didn't want anything to begin under the influence of alcohol or reckless mood. So she pushed him away gently but firmly. His reaction, however, was not what anyone expected. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. What had been a thematic gathering a moment ago suddenly felt unstable, as if the mood itself had cracked. And from that moment on, the night began to move in a direction none of them were prepared for. At some point, things stopped feeling like a themed gathering and started turning into chaos. Sergei suddenly grabbed one of the old wooden crosses near their fire and began tearing it apart, laughing as if it were part of the game. Katerina froze. She was sure Roman would stop him. He was usually the calmer one, the one who liked to talk about meaning and aesthetic boundaries. But instead of stopping Sergei, Roman only encouraged him. And then, even more shocking, Maya joined in too. For a moment, it felt unreal to Katerina. People she considered friends were now treating the cemetery like a playground, crossing lines she never even thought they would approach. She tried to stop them. She raised her voice, telling them they were going too far, that this wasn't just dark fun anymore. But her words disappeared into their laughter, alcohol, and reckless excitement. The fire crackled. Voices overlapped. Someone clapped as if it were a performance. The night felt less like reality and more like something distorted, an ugly celebration of chaos. And Katerina suddenly understood something simple and terrifying. They were not going to listen to her. The thought hit her harder than the noise around her. She stood there for a moment, torn between staying and trying again, or simply leaving everything behind and never looking back. Part of her wanted to run straight back to the dorm, collapse onto her bed, and convince herself this night had never happened. But another part knew she had already lost control of the situation. So she made her choice. Quietly, without announcing anything, she took the keys to her room from her bag and walked away. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, but didn't care. The path back that had felt simple in daylight now seemed completely different. The cemetery was swallowed by darkness, the outlines of trees and stones blending together in a way that made it hard to tell what was real. Every step felt heavier than the last. Katerina had the strange sensation that someone, or something, was watching her from between the graves. Not clearly, not visibly, but constantly, just beyond the edge of perception. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was dense, pressing, alive in a way she couldn't explain. At one point she even stopped, unsure whether she had taken a wrong turn, whether the path had changed or if her fear was simply distorting everything around her. Her breathing became faster. Her pace turned into a near run. All she wanted now was simple: to get out of there, to reach safety, and for this night to end as quickly as possible, before it became something she couldn't forget. The moment Katerina turned onto the narrow path between the graves, something suddenly grabbed her wrist. The touch was ice cold, so cold it felt wrong, almost unreal. A chill ran through her entire arm. "Don't be afraid," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange authority, like it didn't belong to a living son. A man stood in front of her, silent, unfamiliar, his presence unsettling in a way she couldn't explain. He didn't look aggressive, but there was something deeply strict in his gaze. He ordered her to go back. Not to argue. Not to hesitate. Just to return to her friends and make them leave immediately, so they would not disturb the peace of the dead any further. Katerina didn't understand how to respond. Fear took over faster than logic. She ran. When she returned to the fire, everything was still chaos. Laughter, shouting, music. Her friends were still completely absorbed in their reckless celebration. Nothing she said mattered. Her warning about the strange man, the warning she barely understood herself, was met with jokes or ignored entirely. No one believed her. No one even paused. The night continued as if nothing outside their circle existed. Later, in the retelling of that night, people tried to explain what happened. Some said it was imagination. Others insisted it was something else entirely: an old presence, a keeper of the cemetery, a force that reacts when the boundary between the living and the dead is disrespected. In those interpretations, the warning Katerina received was not random. It was selective. And whatever it was, it seemed to spare her while focusing on the others, as if she alone still had a chance to leave before things went too far. Some even said that in places like that, disturbing the dead is never without consequence, that the reaction doesn't always appear immediately, but unfolds later, in ways people don't expect or understand. Katerina eventually left. She realized she could not change what was happening anymore. She returned to the dormitory shaken, cold, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that man again, and felt that icy grip on her wrist. And for the first time, she felt that the night had not truly ended. Morning brought chaos. Screams. Confusion. Panic. Roman was gone. No one knew where he had gone after that night, or what had happened between the moment Katerina left and the moment everything fell apart. Eventually, the official explanation settled on suicide, but no one could clearly say what led him to it. There were only rumors, talk of obsession with death, dark conversations, emotional instability. But nothing that fully explained the outcome. Maya was never the same after Roman's death. She stopped eating properly, stopped talking, stopped reacting. She lay in bed for days, staring at nothing, as if something inside her had shut down completely. 9 days later, she jumped from a dormitory window. She left behind only a short note. "I am happy, because I am going where I will be loved forever." After that, Katerina began to break down under fear and guilt. She couldn't stop thinking about the night at the cemetery. About what she saw, or though odd she saw. About what she did not manage to prevent. And whether it was coincidence, psychology, or something she could never prove, she became convinced of one thing. Something had been set in motion that night, and it was already too late to stop it. What began as a single moment of fear slowly turned into something heavier, something that stayed inside Katerina long after that night had ended. A feeling of guilt took root in her mind and didn't leave. At first it was just thoughts she couldn't silence, then it became repetition, fixation, and eventually something closer to a psychological breakdown. She was no longer just remembering events, she was reliving them. It wasn't necessary to label it too quickly or pretend from a distance that everything could be neatly explained. But it was clear that her emotional state had fractured. She was no longer coping. She needed professional help, not judgment or distance. Because something inside her had clearly been damaged. About half a year later, she learned that Sergei had died in a car accident. That news didn't bring closure. It only deepened the feeling that everything around her was collapsing in an irreversible chain. One loss followed another, and in her mind, it all connected back to that night, even if logically it didn't have to. What replaced panic was resignation. She began to believe that whatever had started back then had already determined the outcome, not only for her friends, but for herself as well. And she no longer felt strong enough to resist it. That was when the drawings began. Crosses. Not as art, not as decoration, but as repetition. A pattern that filled page after page. The same symbol, over and over again, as if her mind was trying to process something it couldn't express in words. She kept reliving that night. The fire, the cemetery, the laughter that turned into something else entirely. Roman, Maya, Sergei, all of them replayed in her memory, each time with the same conclusion: she could have stopped it, but didn't. Or so she believed. Even attempts at treatment did not fully break that cycle. The thoughts returned. Again and again. And with time, she started to feel convinced that one day she would follow the same path as them, not because of external forces, but because she no longer saw an alternative. She often stood by the window, imagining what that end might look like. And then she would hesitate, just briefly, thinking of her parents, of the people who would be left behind. But even that hesitation was fading. From a psychological perspective, what developed here is a classic pattern of guilt fixation, the mind constructing a single causal narrative, and repeatedly returning to it, even when reality is more complex. In such states, people often feel responsible for events far beyond their control. And when guilt becomes absolute, it can start to replace reality. At the same time, another voice appears in narratives like this, one that tries to rationalize death itself as something peaceful, even compassionate. That framing can be dangerous when it becomes detached from real emotional distress, because it can blur the boundary between understanding and justification. Eventually, Katerina was no longer the only focus of this story. A new character appears, Veronica, 27 years old, recently married, spending nearly a year moving between hospitals, unable to fully recover from a sudden, unclear illness that seemed to begin without a clear cause. She would sit by the window, watching the same courtyard every day, feeling trapped in repetition. Her life had narrowed to rooms, routines, and silence. And just like Katerina, her situation began from nothing, or at least that is how it felt from the inside. Her husband's frequent trips, the quiet evenings alone, the growing sense of unease, all of it built slowly, until one day something shifted, and normal life no longer felt stable. And then the phone rang. Veronica hadn't even answered the phone yet, but she already knew who it was. Her mother-in-law. She always called the moment Vadim left for a business trip. Always checking. Always asking subtle questions wrapped in polite concern, like she was verifying something without openly accusing her. Veronica could only smile at the absurdity of it. There was nothing to suspect, at least not in her mind. But a mother-in-law is a mother-in-law. So, as always, Veronica answered calmly, politely, explaining what she was doing, where she was, how her day looked. A rehearsed routine that repeated every time Vadim was away. She hadn't even put the phone down when it hit her. A sudden wave of dizziness. At first she didn't understand what was happening. The room tilted, the edges of reality blurred, her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. A minute later she regained consciousness just enough to reach her phone and call emergency services. Hospital. Tests. Drips. Monitoring. The diagnosis came quickly, a stomach ulcer. Veronica stared at the doctor, confused. Where did it come from? There was no clear answer. Most likely stress, irregular eating habits, and general exhaustion, they told her. From a psychological perspective, prolonged tension often manifests not through direct conflict, but through constant internal pressure. When stress is obvious and open, a person sometimes mobilizes their energy. But when it is subtle, hidden behind politeness, care, and repeated checking, it creates a double message. On the surface, love, concern, friendliness. Underneath, control, suspicion, emotional tension. And the body reacts to that contradiction. It doesn't argue. It simply breaks down. A month later, Veronica was discharged. But she couldn't say she felt better. Weakness remained. Fatigue never left her body. Doctors reassured her it would pass with time, proper diet, and rest. But it didn't. 2 weeks later she was back in the hospital, dizziness again, fever, back pain, exhaustion. This time, a new diagnosis, kidney complications. Stress, medically speaking, often first affects the vascular system. Blood vessels constrict. The body remains in a state of alert, unable to fully relax. From there, different organs begin to suffer. The stomach is especially vulnerable, gastritis, inflammation, ulcers. People even describe it in language itself. I can't digest this situation. Chronic emotional tension becomes physical illness. Back in the hospital, Veronica started noticing a pattern. Every episode seemed to follow the same trigger, Vadim leaving, and the phone call from her mother-in-law shortly after. It could be coincidence. Or it could simply feel like one. Either way, there was no time to focus on it. Her health was now the priority. Weeks passed again under treatment. And then something changed. Nausea returned. Weakness deepened. She fainted once more. This time, the examination revealed something unexpected. Pregnancy. For a moment, everything felt like relief. She and Vadim had been hoping for a child. This should have been the happiest news she had received in a long time. But the doctors were not optimistic. There were serious risks. Her condition made the pregnancy unstable, requiring immediate hospitalization and constant supervision. She was not allowed to go home. Lying in the hospital bed became her only reality. Strangely, it felt like the safest place she had been in months. She focused entirely on protecting the life growing inside her. Nothing else mattered. Even Vadim's next departure on another business trip didn't disturb her as much as before. He came to visit before leaving, trying to reassure her. She believed she would manage. Then, one evening, everything collapsed. A sudden internal complication. Bleeding. Emergency intervention. And the outcome was irreversible. She lost the child. After that, something inside Veronica broke completely. What followed was not just grief, but a collapse of will, an emotional shutdown that left her unable to function the same way again. From a psychological standpoint, people in prolonged conflict situations that they cannot openly express often internalize everything, especially when emotions are suppressed under politeness and peacekeeping. The body becomes the outlet for what cannot be said. Chronic stress, unresolved emotional tension, and suppressed anger can contribute to vascular spasms, digestive disorders, and long-term psychosomatic illness. In extreme cases, it can lead to severe health deterioration. Veronica was moved again. This time, another hospital. Another diagnosis, hepatitis. Another chapter in a body that had been carrying too much for too long. Veronica felt like a prisoner. Visitors were not allowed in her ward. She wasn't permitted to walk into the corridor. Even her roommate had been discharged the day before, leaving her completely alone. The only people she saw were nurses, coming in to give injections, change for drips, and silently check her condition before leaving again. Over time, she grew closest to one of them, a young nurse named Valeria. Valeria was warm, simple, and kind. She came from a rural town and sometimes brought small, approved, treats from home, sneaking them in when possible just to cheer Veronica up. During night shifts, she would sometimes sit by her bed until late, talking about life, relationships, families, and small everyday problems. Her presence made the hospital feel less like a cage. But then, for several days, Valeria stopped coming. Veronica didn't know why. One of the other nurses casually explained that Valeria had been transferred to another building. There had been an emergency, a sick staff member, and she was assigned there indefinitely. Veronica felt the loneliness immediately return. Her husband was away again on a business trip. She had no new books. No strength to read anyway. All she could do was stare out the window and sleep. One afternoon, she woke abruptly. A familiar voice. Valeria was standing beside her bed. Breathless, speaking quickly, clearly disturbed. She told Veronica something she had not expected to hear. While working a shift in the hospital morgue, Valeria had received a strange visit from a woman. The woman waited until she was alone, then asked disturbing things, items associated with the dead, ritual-like objects, and even insisted on placing a photograph inside a coffin. She offered money. Valeria refused to explain too much, but she accepted the photo, partly out of fear, partly because refusing seemed more dangerous. And now she showed it to Veronica. It was her photograph. But torn. Only part of it remained, Veronica standing next to her husband, Vadim. The rest had been cut away. In the background of this story, there were always people who interpreted everyday objects as tools of influence: threads, soap, water, rituals, symbols of control. In their worldview, anything could be turned into a means of affecting someone's life, depending on intention. Whether such beliefs had power or not was less important than the fear they created. Because fear itself becomes a force. Valeria later explained that according to a local folk belief she had heard from an older practitioner, placing a person's photograph into a coffin symbolically ties their fate to death. Whether true or not, people believed in it strongly enough to act on it. And someone had apparently tried to act on Veronica. The next day, a package arrived from her mother-in-law. Veronica couldn't bring herself to open it immediately. When she finally did, she froze. Inside, among the food, was a bar of soap. Not new. Not sealed. Just an ordinary used bar. And it matched exactly what Valeria had described earlier. Later that day, Valeria rushed back to the hospital. She had visited a local folk healer and returned visibly shaken. The healer had examined the photograph and claimed that there was strong negative influence directed at Veronica, allegedly connected to her mother-in-law. Valeria admitted she had taken the money received from the woman and donated part of it to a church, and used the rest to pay for a cleansing ritual and an protective charm. She assured Veronica that now, at least in her interpretation, nothing would be able to harm her anymore. But Veronica, lying alone in her hospital bed, was no longer sure what frightened her more: the idea that someone truly intended harm, or the thought that fear itself had already taken over everything. In some interpretations of the situation, people began to insist that Veronica's illnesses were directly connected to her mother-in-law's actions. According to these beliefs, the repeated appearance of the same photograph, especially in a mortuary context, was seen not just as coincidence, but as symbolic linking. In folkloric thinking, a photograph can represent a person's essence, and placing it among the dead is believed by some to create a kind of psychological or symbolic association with mortality. Within this worldview, even illness itself is sometimes described metaphorically as something alive, as if different conditions occupy the body and behave almost like separate forces. Depending on intention, some people believe such actions could be directed not only toward general harm, but toward escalating outcomes, even extreme ones. However, from a psychological perspective, what matters more is not the literal belief, but the effect it produces. When a person becomes convinced that there is a clearly defined external source of threat, their mental state often changes. Instead of fragmented anxiety, they begin to organize their fear into a single structure. This is the cause. In clinical terms, this can sometimes temporarily increase a person's sense of control. The mind prefers a defined enemy over invisible uncertainty. It allows energy to be redirected outward rather than inward. But it does not necessarily reflect objective reality. It reflects perception. After this shift in perception, Veronica's condition seemed to stabilize. She started wearing the protective object she had been given at all times, never removing it. Whether it had any real effect or not, she felt it gave her a sense of structure and safety. Her condition fluctuated, but there were moments when she felt slightly stronger, more grounded. One day, however, everything changed again. Vadim returned earlier than expected. He had been called back after receiving urgent news. His mother had suddenly fallen seriously ill and been hospitalized. Veronica didn't know how to process the news. On one hand, she felt sympathy for her husband. She listened as he spoke about his mother's condition, her heart problems, the sudden decline. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore a disturbing internal thought, that everything now seemed to be reversing direction, as if consequences were returning to their source. Across all of this, one theme remained constant: cycles of blame, fear, and emotional projection. People often construct narratives where suffering must have a specific origin, someone responsible, someone to blame. In families especially, tension between in-laws can become a long-term emotional conflict shaped by misunderstanding, control, and unresolved resentment. Whether expressed through open hostility or subtle pressure, these dynamics can deeply affect mental and physical health. And yet, no belief system, mystical or psychological, can truly restore what has already been lost. In the end, what remains is simple and unromantic. Human relationships are fragile. And when they are shaped by fear instead of understanding, they rarely lead to happiness.